Among the luminous halls of Asgard, where golden-roofed palaces stretch toward the eternal sky, and the Aesir gods hold dominion over the 9 worlds, few deities command such quiet yet absolute importance as Idunn. Her presence within the Norse pantheon represents something far more fundamental than mere sustenance. She embodies the very essence of perpetual renewal that allows the gods themselves to maintain their divine vigour against the inexorable march of time toward Ragnarok. Idunn occupies a distinctive position within the hierarchical structure of the Aesir, one that transcends traditional concepts of power or martial prowess. While gods like Odin wield wisdom and warcraft, and Thor commands thunder and strength, Idunn's dominion extends over something more subtle yet equally crucial, the preservation of divine youth itself. Her status among the Aesir reflects not conquest or cunning, but rather an indispensable custodianship that makes all other divine activities possible. Without her careful tending of the golden apples, the gods would face the same mortal decay that afflicts all other beings across the cosmos. The goddess appears in the ancient sources as a figure of serene authority, her divine nature manifesting through an almost maternal protectiveness over her sacred charge. Unlike the often tempestuous personalities of her fellow Aesir, Idunn displays a consistent steadiness that mirrors the unchanging nature of her gift. This stability becomes particularly significant when considering the volatile relationships and shifting alliances that characterize much of Norse divine politics. Her reliability serves as an anchor point around which the more dramatic personalities of the pantheon can orbit safely. Archaeological evidence and textual analysis suggest that Idunn's worship may have extended beyond the purely mythological realm into actual religious practice among Scandinavian peoples. Ritual objects discovered in various Scandinavian sites include apple-shaped amulets and ceremonial vessels that may have been used in fertility and youth preservation ceremonies. These artifacts indicate that her influence reached into the daily concerns of mortals who sought her blessing for longevity, health, and the maintenance of vital strength throughout their lives. The etymological investigation of Idunn's name reveals layers of meaning that illuminate her fundamental nature within Norse cosmology. The most widely accepted scholarly interpretation traces her name to the Old Norse Idunn, which appears to derive from the verb idja, meaning to work or to be active, combined with elements suggesting perpetual motion or renewal. This linguistic construction points towards her role as an active agent of regeneration, rather than a passive vessel of youth. Alternative etymological theories propose connections to Proto-Germanic roots meaning again or anew, which would render her name as something approximating she who makes young again or the renewer. This interpretation aligns closely with her mythological function and suggests that her identity as a rejuvenating force was recognized from the earlier stages of Germanic religious development. The consistency of this meaning across various dialectical variations of her name throughout Scandinavian regions indicates the widespread recognition of her essential nature. Some linguistic scholars have identified potential connections between Idunn's name and terms related to eating or consuming, which would create a direct link between her identity and the act of consuming her apples. This interpretation emphasizes the active participation required in the renewal process. The gods must regularly partake of her gift, rather than simply existing in her presence. The cyclical nature of this consumption reflects broader Norse concepts about the necessity of constant vigilance and active maintenance of divine order. The phonetic evolution of her name across different periods and regions provides additional insights into how various Norse communities understood her role. In some areas, variations emphasize the ever or eternal aspect, while others stress the active working nature of her renewal process. These regional differences suggest that while her fundamental importance remained constant, different communities may have emphasized particular aspects of her divine nature based on their specific needs and circumstances. Idunn's marriage to Bragi represents one of the most symbolically rich unions within the Norse pantheon, creating a partnership that embodies the relationship between eternal youth and artistic inspiration. Bragi, recognised as the god of poetry and eloquence, brings to their union the power of words to preserve memory and transmit wisdom across generations. This pairing suggests a deeper understanding within Norse thought about the connections between physical vitality and creative expression. The symbolic implications of their marriage extend far beyond personal affection or political alliance. Together, they represent the dual aspects of immortality that the Norse mind recognised as essential: the preservation of the body through Idunn's apples, and the preservation of memory and achievement through Bragi's poetry. Their union creates a complete system of divine preservation that addresses both the physical and cultural aspects of eternal existence. Bragi's role as the divine skald brings particular significance to their partnership. In Norse society, skalds held responsibility for preserving the deeds and wisdom of heroes and gods through their verses. By marrying the goddess of youth, Bragi symbolically ensures that the stories and achievements he preserves will have subjects worthy of eternal remembrance. The gods who consume Idunn's apples will continue to perform deeds worth celebrating in Bragi's verse. Their relationship also reflects practical considerations within the divine community. Bragi's poetry requires not just inspiration, but the physical vitality to compose and perform his works. Idunn's gift ensures that his creative faculties remain sharp and his voice strong throughout the ages. Conversely, Bragi's verses celebrate and preserve the importance of Idunn's role, ensuring that her contributions to divine society receive proper recognition and understanding. The domestic arrangements of their marriage provide insight into the daily operations of divine society in Asgard. Their hall serves as both a repository for the golden apples and a centre of cultural activity where gods gather to hear Bragi's latest compositions. This dual function creates a natural gathering place where the essential business of renewal intersects with the social and cultural life of the divine community. Their partnership demonstrates how the Norse understood the interconnectedness of different aspects of divine power. Neither youth without purpose nor art without vitality could achieve the complete preservation that the gods required. Their marriage creates a synthesis that addresses the full spectrum of divine needs, from the most basic physical requirements to the highest cultural aspirations. The absence of children from their union has prompted scholarly speculation about the symbolic meaning of their relationship. Some interpretations suggest that their creative energies flow entirely into their respective divine functions, Idunn's nurturing of the apples and Bragi's composition of verses. Others propose that their union represents a form of spiritual rather than biological fertility, generating the conditions necessary for all divine creativity and renewal. Within the broader context of Norse divine relationships, Idunn and Bragi's marriage stands out for its stability and mutual support. While many divine unions in Norse mythology involve conflict, jealousy, or political maneuvering, their relationship appears to be characterized by harmony and shared purpose. This stability reflects the essential nature of their combined functions within the divine community. Both are too crucial to the survival and flourishing of the gods to be disrupted by personal discord. The goddess maintains her orchard with meticulous care, ensuring that each apple reaches perfect ripeness at precisely the moment when the gods require renewal. This careful timing demonstrates her deep understanding of the rhythms of divine existence and her ability to anticipate the needs of her fellow deities. Her skill in this regard goes beyond mere gardening to encompass a sophisticated understanding of divine physiology and the varying rates at which different gods experience the effects of time. The sacred grove where Idunn tends her miraculous apples exists as one of the most carefully guarded locations within Asgard, a place where the very air shimmers with concentrated life force and the ground itself pulses with regenerative energy. Ancient sources describe this orchard as occupying a protected valley surrounded by crystalline barriers that filter and intensify the cosmic energies flowing from Yggdrasil itself. The trees bearing these extraordinary fruits grow in perfect geometric patterns, their branches heavy with golden orbs that emit a subtle luminescence visible even in the bright eternal daylight of the divine realm. Each apple possesses a unique internal structure that defies conventional understanding of fruit anatomy. Rather than containing seeds in the traditional sense, these magical specimens harbour concentrated essence of temporal reversal, manifesting as tiny crystalline formations that sparkle like captured starlight when the fruit is cut open. The flesh itself displays an opalescent quality, shifting between shades of gold, amber and pearl depending on the angle of observation. This visual transformation reflects the apple's fundamental nature as a bridge between different states of existence, capable of reversing the entropic processes that normally govern all living beings. The supernatural properties of these fruits operate through mechanisms that transcend ordinary biological processes. When consumed, the apple's essence immediately begins restructuring the cellular composition of the consumer, reversing accumulated damage and restoring tissues to their optimal state. This restoration occurs at the molecular level, with the apple's magic systematically identifying and correcting the subtle deteriorations that accumulate over time. The process affects not merely the physical form, but extends to divine consciousness itself, sharpening mental faculties and maintaining the clarity of thought essential for divine wisdom. The transformation begins within moments of consumption, as the apple's essence disperses through the divine bloodstream. Unlike mortal healing, which requires time and rest, this regeneration happens instantaneously while the god continues their normal activities. The magic works by temporarily suspending the natural flow of time within the consumer's body, creating a localized temporal field where entropy reverses its normal direction. This reversal affects everything from the microscopic structure of divine tissues to the complex energy patterns that maintain divine consciousness. The apples demonstrate remarkable intelligence in their restorative effects, automatically adjusting their potency based on the specific needs of each consumer. When Odin partakes of the fruit, the magic concentrates on maintaining the complex neural pathways required for his vast accumulation of wisdom and his ability to process information from his ravens and wolves. For Thor, the restoration focuses primarily on maintaining the tremendous physical strength required to wield Mjolnir and protect Asgard from giants and other threats. This adaptive quality suggests that the apples possess a form of consciousness that allows them to analyze and respond to individual divine physiology. The fruits also display temporal sensitivity, with their potency fluctuating according to cosmic cycles and the proximity of significant mythological events. During periods when the forces of chaos press more strongly against the ordered realm of Asgard, the apples naturally increase their regenerative power to compensate for the additional stress placed upon the gods. Conversely, during times of relative peace, their effects moderate to provide steady maintenance rather than dramatic restoration. This cyclical variation ensures that the gods receive precisely the level of renewal required by their circumstances. The ritualistic consumption of these sacred fruits follows elaborate protocols developed over countless ages of divine existence. The gods gather in Idunn's hall according to a carefully maintained schedule that accounts for both individual needs and the collective requirements of divine society. The timing of these gatherings reflects sophisticated understanding of divine metabolism and the varying rates at which different deities experience temporal effects. Odin, due to his constant expenditure of energy in pursuit of wisdom and his responsibilities as All-Father, requires more frequent renewal than gods whose duties demand less continuous exertion. The ceremony itself begins with Idunn's careful selection of the appropriate fruit for each participant. She examines each apple with the practiced eye of one who has performed this ritual for millennia, assessing its readiness through subtle indicators visible only to her trained perception. The selection process involves not merely choosing ripe fruit, but matching specific apples to the particular needs of individual gods based on their recent activities and current spiritual condition. This personalized approach ensures maximum effectiveness and prevents the waste of these precious resources. The actual consumption takes place in a specific order, determined by both hierarchy and need. Odin typically receives his apple first, reflecting his position as leader of the Aesir and his constant need for renewal due to his demanding responsibilities. Frigg follows, then the other major deities according to their roles and current circumstances. The younger gods and those with less demanding duties receive their portions last, though this order reflects practical considerations rather than any diminishment of their importance within the divine community. Each god consumes their apple in a prescribed manner that maximizes the fruit's effectiveness. The process involves careful chewing to release the full spectrum of magical essences, followed by a brief period of meditation that allows the transformation to proceed without interference. During this contemplative phase, the gods often experience vivid recollections of their greatest achievements and clearest moments of divine insight, as the apple's magic reinforces the mental patterns associated with their peak performance. The cosmic significance of these apples extends far beyond their immediate effects on individual gods to encompass their role in maintaining the fundamental balance between order and chaos that defines Norse cosmology. The fruits serve as a crucial component in the divine defense against the entropic forces constantly working to dissolve the structured reality of the nine worlds. Without the renewal provided by Idunn's apples, the gods would gradually succumb to the same decay that affects all other beings, leaving the cosmos vulnerable to the destructive influences of giants, monsters, and other chaotic entities. The apples function as anchors of stability within the cosmic order, their regenerative power creating zones of reversed entropy that help maintain the structural integrity of reality itself. Each consumption sends ripples of renewed energy throughout Yggdrasil's root system, strengthening the world tree's ability to support the weight of the nine worlds and resist the constant pressure exerted by the forces of dissolution. This connection explains why threats to Idunn and her apples represent existential dangers not merely to individual gods, but to the entire cosmic structure. The relationship between the apples and the concept of fate adds another layer of complexity to their cosmic significance. While the Norns weave the threads of destiny for all beings, the apples exist partially outside this system, creating pockets of temporal flexibility that allow the gods to maintain their effectiveness as agents of order, despite the predetermined nature of their ultimate fate at Ragnarok. This partial exemption from fate's absolute authority enables the gods to continue their essential work of maintaining cosmic balance, even while knowing that their efforts are ultimately doomed to failure. The magical fruits also serve as a counterbalance to the various forces of aging and decay that permeate the Norse cosmos. Giants, trolls, and other chaotic beings possess their own forms of longevity, often achieved through dark magic or bargains with malevolent powers. The apples provide the gods with a pure source of renewal that maintains their moral and spiritual integrity, while granting them the temporal advantages necessary to compete with these corrupted forms of immortality. The apple's influence extends to the very fabric of divine culture and society within Asgard. Their regular consumption creates shared experiences that bind the gods together as a community, with each ritual feast serving as both practical necessity and social bonding opportunity. The knowledge that all gods depend equally upon Idunn's gift fosters a sense of mutual interdependence that transcends individual rivalries and political disagreements. Even the most prideful deities must acknowledge their absolute dependence upon her careful stewardship. The seasonal variations in the apple's properties reflect their deep connection to the cosmic cycles that govern all existence within the Norse worldview. During the spring months, when new life emerges throughout the nine worlds, the fruits display enhanced regenerative properties that help the gods recover from the trials of winter and prepare for the active season ahead. Summer brings apples with increased potency for maintaining peak performance during the period of greatest divine activity. Autumn's harvest provides fruit specifically attuned to preparing for the challenges of winter, while winter apples offer sustained warmth and vitality during the darkest months. The cultivation methods employed by Idunn involve techniques that blend practical horticulture with sophisticated magical practices. She tends her trees using tools forged from meteoric iron and blessed by the dwarves, implements that can channel and direct the cosmic energies necessary for proper fruit development. The soil of her orchard contains carefully balanced mixtures of earth from all 9 worlds, creating a growing medium that reflects the full spectrum of cosmic influences and ensures that each apple develops the complete range of regenerative properties. The tranquil routine of divine renewal that had sustained Asgard for countless ages would face its gravest threat through an incident that began as nothing more than an exploratory journey beyond the familiar borders of the gods' realm. Odin, driven by his insatiable hunger for knowledge and his need to monitor the activities of potentially hostile forces throughout the 9 worlds, had organised an expedition that would take him far from the golden halls of Asgard into territories where giant kind held sway. The Allfather's companions on this fateful venture were Hoenir, his brother and fellow member of the original triad of gods who had shaped the world from Ymir's corpse, and Loki, whose shapeshifting abilities and cunning intellect made him invaluable for reconnaissance missions in dangerous territory. The 3 divine travellers had ventured deep into Jotunheim, moving through landscapes where massive stone formations jutted from barren plains like the bones of primordial titans, and where the very air seemed to thicken with the wild magic that characterized the giant realm. Their journey had proceeded without significant incident for several days, with Loki scouting ahead in various animal forms, while Odin gathered intelligence about giant activities and Hoenir provided his measured counsel on the strategic implications of their observations. The expedition represented routine divine statecraft, the kind of careful monitoring that allowed the Aesir to maintain their defensive posture against potential threats from the chaotic forces that surrounded their ordered realm. The morning that would forever alter the fate of Idunn and her precious apples began with the 3 gods making camp in a secluded valley, where a clear stream provided fresh water and scattered groves offered both shelter and fuel for their fire. Hoenir had successfully hunted a large ox during the previous evening, and the companions looked forward to a substantial meal before continuing their journey deeper into giant territory. The ox, a massive beast with hide thick as leather armour and horns that could have served as spear points, represented enough meat to sustain them for several days of hard travel through the inhospitable landscape of Jotunheim. Loki, ever practical despite his reputation for mischief, took charge of preparing the cooking fire while Odin consulted his ravens for intelligence about the surrounding area. The trickster god gathered deadwood from the scattered trees and arranged it in a carefully constructed pyre designed to generate intense heat for roasting the substantial carcass. Hoenir, meanwhile, used his considerable strength to prepare the ox for cooking, skinning the beast with practiced efficiency and sectioning the meat into manageable portions. The routine nature of these preparations masked the significance of what was about to unfold, as none of the 3 gods suspected that their simple meal would trigger a chain of events leading to the greatest crisis Asgard had ever faced. The fire blazed hot and bright in the crisp morning air, sending columns of smoke rising straight up in the windless atmosphere. The gods arranged the choicest portions of ox meat on improvised spits, positioning them at optimal distances from the flames to ensure even cooking. The aroma of roasting meat began to fill the valley, a rich and satisfying scent that should have heralded a pleasant interlude in their journey. However, as the morning progressed and the fire continued to burn, it became increasingly apparent that something was preventing the meat from cooking properly. Despite the intensity of the flames and the careful positioning of the spits, the ox meat remained stubbornly raw, showing no signs of the browning and searing that should have occurred within the first hour of cooking. Loki, whose expertise in practical matters extended to culinary skills acquired during his various adventures, examined the fire arrangement multiple times, adjusting the positioning of the meat and adding fresh fuel to maintain optimal heat. Odin, though primarily concerned with weightier matters of cosmic significance, possessed enough practical experience to recognize that something supernatural was interfering with their simple meal preparation. Hoenir, whose divine nature granted him particular sensitivity to magical influences, was the first to detect the presence of an external force affecting their cooking fire. He noticed subtle distortions in the air above the flames, almost imperceptible fluctuations that suggested the influence of powerful magic. The realization that they were not alone in the valley, and that some entity was actively interfering with their activities, immediately transformed what had seemed like a minor inconvenience into a potential threat requiring careful assessment and response. The source of their difficulty revealed itself with dramatic suddenness when an enormous eagle descended from the clear sky above, its wings spanning a distance that blocked out the sun and cast the entire valley into temporary shadow. The bird was of such immense proportions that its individual feathers appeared as large as shields, and its talons could have easily grasped a full-grown horse. The creature's eyes burned with an intelligence that immediately identified it as something far more than a natural bird, and its voice, when it spoke, carried the deep resonance of a being accustomed to commanding respect and obedience from lesser creatures. The eagle perched on a massive boulder overlooking their camp and addressed the three gods with casual familiarity, as though their presence in his territory was a matter of routine interest rather than surprise. The creature identified itself as the source of their cooking difficulties, explaining that his magical influence was preventing their fire from properly preparing their meal. This revelation confirmed the gods' suspicions about supernatural interference, while simultaneously introducing an element of negotiation into what could have developed into a direct confrontation. The giant in eagle form, for the gods quickly recognized the creature's true nature despite its avian disguise, proposed a bargain that seemed reasonable on its surface. In exchange for allowing their fire to function normally and permitting them to enjoy their roasted ox, he requested only a portion of the meal for himself. The proposal appeared to represent standard protocol for encounters between divine beings in neutral territory, where mutual courtesy and reciprocal favours help maintain peaceful relations between potentially hostile parties. Odin, Hoenir and Loki exchanged glances that communicated their shared assessment of the situation. The giant's request seemed modest enough, and his demonstrated power over their fire made it clear that he possessed the ability to make their stay in the valley either comfortable or extremely difficult. The strategic value of maintaining cordial relations with a powerful giant in his own territory outweighed the cost of sharing their meal, particularly since they had secured more than enough meat to satisfy their own needs. The Allfather nodded his agreement to the proposed arrangement, speaking for his companions and accepting the giant's terms. The eagle's response to their acceptance was immediate and dramatic. The magical interference that had prevented their fire from cooking the meat vanished instantly, and the flames began their proper work with renewed vigour. The ox meat, which had remained stubbornly raw despite hours over the fire, began to brown and sear as though it had just been placed over the coals. The aroma of properly roasting meat filled the valley, and the gods found themselves anticipating their delayed meal with renewed appetite. However, the giant's interpretation of a portion proved far more expansive than the gods had anticipated. When the meat had finished cooking and they began to divide it among themselves, the eagle descended from his perch and claimed not merely a reasonable share, but the choicest cuts from the entire ox. His massive talons seized the hindquarters and the prime sections of the back, leaving the gods with scraps and lesser portions that barely constituted a meal adequate for one divine being, much less three who had been travelling hard through difficult terrain. Loki, whose quick temper and sense of justice were equally well developed, reacted to this obvious breach of their agreement with characteristic directness. The trickster god seized a long wooden staff that had been used to tend the fire and struck the greedy eagle with all the considerable strength at his disposal. The blow landed solidly across the bird's back, producing a sound like thunder echoing through the valley and demonstrating that Loki's divine strength was more than capable of affecting even a giant in animal form. The consequences of Loki's impulsive action exceeded anything he could have anticipated. Rather than simply driving off the thieving giant or teaching him a lesson about fair dealing, the blow triggered a magical binding that fused the staff to the eagle's body, while simultaneously attaching Loki's hands to the other end of the wooden rod. The trickster god found himself helplessly connected to the giant, unable to release his grip on the staff regardless of how desperately he struggled to free himself from the magical bond. The giant, now revealed as Thiazi through the magical connection that linked him to Loki, immediately took advantage of his captive's helpless condition. The enormous eagle launched himself into the air with powerful wing beats that carried both himself and the struggling Loki high above the valley floor. The trickster god, still magically bound to the staff that remained fused to Thiazi's body, found himself being dragged through the air at tremendous speed, his body subjected to impacts against rocks, trees and other obstacles as the giant deliberately flew low enough to maximize his captive's discomfort. Thiazi's flight path took them far from the valley where Odin and Hoenir waited, carrying Loki over increasingly wild and desolate terrain where jagged peaks thrust upward like spear points and deep canyons yawned like hungry mouths. The giant demonstrated his complete control over their shared flight, alternately soaring to heights where the thin air made breathing difficult and diving toward rocky surfaces that threatened to dash Loki against unforgiving stone. The physical punishment was clearly intended as both immediate retribution for the staff blow and a demonstration of the giant's power to inflict far worse consequences if his demands were not met. The torment continued for what seemed like hours, with Loki's divine constitution allowing him to survive impacts and stresses that would have killed any mortal being. His clothing was torn to shreds by contact with rough surfaces, and his body bore the marks of countless scrapes and bruises despite his supernatural resilience. The psychological effect of complete helplessness proved even more damaging than the physical punishment, as Loki found himself entirely at the mercy of a being whose intentions remained unclear, but whose capacity for inflicting suffering had been thoroughly demonstrated. Eventually, Thiazi grew tired of his sport and settled on a high mountain peak, where the air was thin and cold, and the nearest signs of life were far below in distant valleys. The giant resumed his true form, revealing himself as a creature of immense proportions even by the standards of Jotunheim. His features bore the harsh angles and weathered texture characteristic of mountain giants, and his eyes held the cold intelligence of a being who had survived and prospered in one of the most hostile environments in the Nine Worlds. The magical binding that had connected Loki to the staff dissolved, leaving the trickster god free to move but trapped on an isolated peak with no means of escape. Thiazi's true purpose in capturing Loki became apparent as he began to outline the price for the trickster god's freedom. The giant had not acted on mere impulse or wounded pride over the staff blow, but had instead seen an opportunity to acquire something he'd long desired, but had never been able to obtain through direct action. His demand was simple in its statement, but catastrophic in its implications. Loki must deliver Idunn and her golden apples into Thiazi's power, or remain forever imprisoned in the giant's mountain stronghold. The giant's knowledge of Idunn's importance to the Aesir was both comprehensive and disturbing in its accuracy. Thiazi understood not merely that the goddess possessed apples that granted youth, but grasped the full extent of the god's dependence upon her gift for maintaining their divine status. He had clearly spent considerable time studying the internal workings of Asgard's society, identifying the single point of vulnerability that could bring the entire pantheon under his influence. The kidnapping of Idunn would not merely deprive the gods of their source of renewal, but would place their continued existence entirely at his discretion. Thiazi's motivation for seeking control over the goddess and her apples extended beyond simple desire for immortality or youth. The giant possessed his own form of longevity, sustained through magical practices and his fundamental nature as one of the primordial forces of the cosmos. His true goal was to acquire leverage over the Aesir that would fundamentally alter the balance of power between the ordered realm of Asgard and the chaotic forces of Jotunheim. With Idunn under his control, he could dictate terms to Odin himself and potentially reshape the cosmic order according to his own vision. The giant's plan for acquiring Idunn revealed a sophisticated understanding of both divine psychology and the practical challenges involved in penetrating Asgard's defences. Rather than attempting a direct assault on the god's stronghold, which would inevitably fail against their combined might, Thiazi had devised a scheme that would use Loki's trusted position within Asgard's society to accomplish what no external force could achieve. The trickster god's reputation for cunning and his known ability to convince others to take risks would provide the perfect cover for luring Idunn away from the safety of her protected grove. Loki found himself confronting an impossible choice between personal freedom and loyalty to his fellow gods. The giant's threat was entirely credible, as demonstrated by the ease with which he had captured and tormented the trickster god, despite Loki's considerable powers and experience in escaping from difficult situations. The mountain peak where they stood was clearly warded against magical escape, and Thiazi's own formidable abilities made any attempt at physical resistance futile. The only realistic option for securing his release lay in accepting the giant's terms and finding some way to deliver Idunn into his power. The internal conflict that raged within Loki during his captivity reflected the complex nature of his relationship with the other, Aesir, and his own moral framework. Despite his reputation for mischief and his occasional conflicts with his fellow gods, Loki had always maintained fundamental loyalty to Asgard and its inhabitants. His tricks and schemes, while sometimes causing temporary difficulties, had never threatened the essential interests of the divine community or endangered the cosmic order that the gods work to maintain. The betrayal that Thiazi demanded would cross lines that Loki had never previously contemplated, transforming him from an occasionally troublesome ally into an active threat to everything he had helped to build and protect. The psychological pressure applied by Thiazi went far beyond simple threats of continued imprisonment or physical harm. The giant demonstrated intimate knowledge of Loki's deepest fears and insecurities, particularly his anxiety about his status within Asgard society as an outsider who had been accepted into the divine community despite his giant heritage. Thiazi exploited these vulnerabilities by suggesting that Loki's fellow gods had never truly accepted him as an equal and would readily sacrifice him to protect their own interests. The giant's words found fertile ground in Loki's existing doubts about his place among the Aesir, magnifying his sense of isolation and resentment. The manipulation tactics employed by Thiazi revealed his deep understanding of divine psychology and his ability to exploit the fault lines that existed within even the most stable relationships. He presented Loki's situation as a choice between certain destruction and a chance to prove his worth through a demonstration of superior cunning. The giant framed the betrayal of Idunn not as treachery against trusted allies, but as a test of Loki's skill in outwitting opponents who had never fully appreciated his contributions to their society. This reframing allowed the trickster god to contemplate actions that would otherwise have been unthinkable by recasting them as justified responses to perceived slights and undervaluation. The broader implications of divine betrayal within the Norse mythological framework added layers of cosmic significance to Loki's dilemma that extended far beyond the immediate consequences for individual gods. The Norse worldview recognized betrayal as one of the fundamental forces that would ultimately bring about the destruction of the current cosmic order during Ragnarok. Loki's decision to betray Idunn would represent not merely a personal failing, but a crack in the foundation of a divine society that would widen over time until it brought down the entire structure of ordered reality. The concept of oath-breaking held particular significance within Norse culture and mythology, where sworn bonds represented sacred commitments that maintained the stability of social relationships. Loki's acceptance of Thiazi's demands would violate multiple levels of obligation, from his general duty as a member of Asgard's community to his specific responsibilities as someone who had been trusted with knowledge of Idunn's importance and vulnerability. The breaking of these oaths would create spiritual consequences that would extend far beyond the immediate practical effects of his actions. The weight of Thiazi's ultimatum pressed upon Loki's consciousness like a physical burden as he found himself facing the most consequential decision of his existence. The giant's demand represented more than simple betrayal. It required the systematic exploitation of trust that had been built over countless centuries of shared experiences and mutual dependence. Yet the alternative of eternal imprisonment on the desolate mountain peak, coupled with Thiazi's demonstrated capacity for creative torment, made the choice appear inevitable despite its horrific implications for the divine community he'd sworn to protect. During the long days of his captivity, Loki began constructing the elaborate deception that would be necessary to accomplish Thiazi's goals while maintaining his own survival. The plan that gradually took shape in his mind represented a masterpiece of psychological manipulation, designed to exploit Idunn's most fundamental characteristics while providing plausible explanations for actions that would otherwise raise immediate suspicion among the vigilant gods of Asgard. The scheme required intimate knowledge of the goddess's personality, her daily routines, and the specific vulnerabilities that could be leveraged to overcome her natural caution. The foundation of Loki's strategy rested upon his accurate assessment of Idunn's trusting nature and her genuine dedication to her role as keeper of the golden apples. Unlike many of the Aesir, who had developed sophisticated defences against deception through centuries of political manoeuvring and conflict with hostile forces, Idunn operated from a framework of assumed good faith that made her particularly vulnerable to carefully crafted lies. Her position within Asgard society had never required her to develop the suspicious mindset that characterised gods like Odin or Heimdall, whose responsibilities demanded constant vigilance against potential threats. The goddess's intellectual curiosity about her divine responsibilities provided another avenue for manipulation that Loki recognised and planned to exploit. Idunn's dedication to maintaining the perfect quality of her apples had led her to spend countless hours studying the magical properties of various fruits and experimenting with different cultivation techniques. This scholarly interest in her craft created an opening for suggestions about superior methods or remarkable discoveries that might enhance her ability to serve the divine community. Loki understood that appeals to professional pride and the desire for improvement would carry more weight with Idunn than simple requests for personal favours. The timing of the deception required careful consideration of Asgard's seasonal rhythms and the predictable patterns of divine activity. Loki chose a period when many of the major gods were occupied with their individual responsibilities and less likely to notice unusual activities or question unexpected absences. Odin's frequent journeys to gather wisdom throughout the 9 worlds, Thor's expeditions against giants and monsters, and the various duties that kept other gods away from the central halls of Asgard created windows of opportunity when Idunn might be approached without immediate oversight from more suspicious divine authorities. The specific approach that Loki developed involved presenting himself to Idunn as the bearer of extraordinary news about a discovery that could revolutionize her understanding of divine horticulture. He would claim to have encountered, during his recent travels beyond Asgard's borders, a grove of apple trees whose fruit possessed properties that surpassed even her own golden apples in their ability to grant youth and vitality. The supposed discovery would be located in a region of Midgard known for its exceptional magical properties, far enough from Asgard to require a significant journey, but not so distant as to seem completely implausible. The fabricated details of this mythical grove required careful construction to maintain credibility under Idunn's knowledgeable scrutiny. Loki prepared descriptions of trees whose branches grew in impossible geometric patterns, bearing fruit that changed colour according to the phases of the moon and possessed internal structures unlike anything found in conventional apples. He would claim that the magical soil in which these trees grew contained minerals from all 9 worlds, creating a growing medium that concentrated cosmic forces in ways that even Idunn's carefully tended orchard could not match. The psychological hook that would make this deception irresistible to Idunn lay in Loki's suggestion that these superior apples could enhance her ability to serve her fellow gods. Rather than presenting the discovery as a threat to her position or a replacement for her current methods, he would frame it as an opportunity for professional advancement that would increase her value to the divine community. The implication that she could return to Asgard with knowledge and specimens that would improve the quality of renewal available to all gods would appeal to her selfless dedication to her responsibilities. Loki's manipulation strategy also incorporated carefully crafted appeals to Idunn's sense of duty and her desire to ensure the continued welfare of the Aesir. He would suggest that the current threats facing the divine community, particularly the increasing boldness of giants and other chaotic forces, required enhanced forms of renewal that could better prepare the gods for the challenges ahead. The superior apples he claimed to have discovered would provide exactly the kind of improved vitality that the gods needed to maintain their effectiveness in defending the cosmic order against increasingly dangerous enemies. The element of urgency that Loki planned to introduce into his deception served multiple purposes within the overall strategy. By claiming that the magical grove existed only during specific cosmic alignments that occurred rarely and unpredictably, he could create pressure for immediate action that would prevent Idunn from seeking advice from other gods or taking time to carefully consider the implications of his proposal. The suggestion that this opportunity might not arise again for centuries would exploit her fear of failing in her responsibilities to the divine community. The practical aspects of the deception required Loki to address potential objections and provide convincing explanations for why this journey needed to be undertaken in secret. He prepared arguments about the need to verify the discovery personally before raising hopes among the other gods, and the importance of maintaining secrecy to prevent giants or other enemies from learning about and potentially corrupting this valuable resource. These explanations would appeal to Idunn's cautious nature, while providing rational justifications for actions that would otherwise seem suspicious. The route that Loki planned to take with Idunn had been carefully selected to maximize the chances of successful delivery to Thiazi, while minimizing the risk of intervention by other gods. The path would lead through regions of Midgard where divine presence was minimal and where the giants' agents could monitor their progress without detection. Strategic stops along the way would provide opportunities for Thiazi's allies to confirm that the plan was proceeding according to schedule and make any necessary adjustments to ensure success. Loki's understanding of Idunn's daily routines allowed him to identify the optimal moment for approaching her with his fabricated proposal. The goddess typically spent her early morning hours tending to her trees and examining the ripening fruit, a time when she was most receptive to discussions about horticultural matters and least likely to be interrupted by other gods seeking her attention. Her focused concentration during these periods would also make her more susceptible to persuasive arguments that aligned with her professional interests and concerns. The psychological profile that Loki had developed of Idunn through years of observation revealed specific personality traits that could be exploited to overcome her natural caution. Her genuine humility about her own knowledge and her respect for the experiences of gods who travelled widely throughout the 9 worlds made her particularly receptive to claims about discoveries in distant realms. Her assumption that other gods possessed superior wisdom in areas outside her expertise created vulnerabilities that could be exploited through carefully presented false information. The goddess's relationship with her husband Bragi provided both opportunities and challenges for Loki's deception. While Bragi's frequent absences on missions to gather material for his poetry created windows when Idunn might be approached without his protective oversight, his intimate knowledge of his wife's character and responsibilities meant that any deception would need to account for his potential questions and concerns. Loki prepared explanations that would satisfy Bragi's inquiries while maintaining the secrecy necessary for the plan's success. The broader context of divine politics within Asgard influenced the specific approaches that Loki planned to use in convincing Idunn to accompany him on this fatal journey. Recent tensions between different factions of gods, combined with ongoing concerns about external threats, had created an atmosphere where individual initiative and proactive measures were generally encouraged rather than questioned. This environment would work in favour of Loki's deception by making Idunn's decision to investigate potential improvements to her methods seem responsible rather than reckless. The magical protections that surrounded Idunn's grove presented technical challenges that required careful consideration in planning the deception. These wards were designed to prevent unauthorized access to the sacred apples and alert other gods to any threats against the goddess herself. Loki's plan needed to account for these defenses by ensuring that Idunn's departure appeared voluntary and routine, rather than the result of coercion or trickery. The goddess's own presence and cooperation would be essential for bypassing the magical barriers without triggering alarms. The emotional manipulation that formed the core of Loki's strategy involved exploiting Idunn's deepest fears about failing in her responsibilities to the divine community. He would suggest that her current methods, while adequate for past challenges, might prove insufficient for the trials that lay ahead as the cosmic order faced increasing pressure from chaotic forces. The implication that she had a duty to explore every possible means of enhancing her service to the gods would create internal pressure that would override her natural caution and skepticism. The specific lies that Loki prepared to tell Idunn were crafted with meticulous attention to detail and internal consistency. Each element of the fabricated story about the superior apple grove was designed to reinforce the others, creating a web of false information that would be difficult to disprove without extensive investigation. The descriptions of the magical trees, the properties of their fruit, and the cosmic conditions that made their existence possible were all constructed to seem plausible to someone with Idunn's level of expertise, while being impossible to verify quickly. The moment when Loki would finally approach Idunn with his carefully constructed deception represented the culmination of weeks of preparation and psychological analysis. Every word, gesture, and expression would need to convey sincerity and urgency, while concealing the betrayal that lay at the heart of his proposal. The success of the entire plan would depend upon his ability to overcome the natural trust and affection that had characterized their relationship for centuries, transforming these positive bonds into weapons that could be used against the goddess herself. The deception that Loki had so carefully constructed reached its terrible fruition on a morning when golden light filtered through the crystalline barriers of Idunn's sacred grove, casting rainbow patterns across the dew-laden grass where the goddess moved with her characteristic grace between the rows of miraculous apple trees. The trickster god approached her during the quiet hour, when she typically conducted her most detailed examinations of the ripening fruit, her attention focused entirely on the subtle indicators that revealed each apple's readiness for harvest. His voice carried the perfect blend of excitement and scholarly curiosity as he began weaving the web of lies that would soon deliver the most precious goddess in Asgard directly into the waiting talons of her greatest enemy. Idunn's response to Loki's fabricated tale of the superior apple grove exceeded even his most optimistic expectations. The goddess listened with growing fascination as he described the impossible trees with their geometrically perfect branches and fruit that shifted through spectrum of colours according to celestial movements. Her questions revealed both her deep expertise in divine horticulture and her genuine hunger for knowledge that might enhance her ability to serve the Aesir. When Loki mentioned the cosmic alignment that would make this discovery accessible for only a brief window of time, her scholarly excitement overcame the natural caution that might otherwise have prompted her to seek counsel from Odin or her husband Bragi. The goddess's decision to accompany Loki on his supposed mission of verification represented the culmination of psychological manipulation, so subtle and comprehensive that she believed herself to be acting entirely according to her own judgment and professional dedication. Her preparations for the journey included selecting several of her finest apples to serve as comparison specimens, carefully wrapping them in silk cloth that would preserve their magical properties during transport. The irony of this precaution would become devastatingly apparent only after it was far too late to matter, as these very apples would soon become prizes in Thiazi's collection rather than tools for scholarly analysis. The route that Loki chose for their journey led through regions of Midgard where the boundary between the ordered realm of human habitation and the wild territories claimed by giants grew increasingly thin. Ancient forests stretched across rolling hills where massive stone formations suggested the presence of sleeping titans, and the air itself seemed to thicken with primal magic that made mortal creatures avoid these areas through instinctive recognition of powers beyond their understanding. Idunn focused on reaching their supposed destination and conducting her comparative analysis of the mythical superior fruit, paid little attention to the subtle signs that indicated they were moving steadily closer to territories where giant kind held dominion. Thiazi had positioned himself with strategic precision along the path that his unwitting accomplice would follow, his massive form concealed within a grove of ancient oaks, whose twisted branches provided perfect camouflage for a creature of his enormous proportions. The giant had spent days studying the terrain and weather patterns, ensuring that when the moment came for his dramatic revelation and capture of Idunn, every environmental factor would work in his favour. The morning mist that clung to the valley floor would help conceal his initial movements, while the clear sky above provided unlimited space for the aerial pursuit that would carry his prize far beyond any possibility of rescue by her fellow gods. The transformation from Thiazi's humanoid giant form into his eagle shape represented one of the most spectacular displays of shape-shifting magic ever witnessed in the Nine Worlds. His body expanded and stretched as bones lengthened and reshaped themselves according to avian anatomy, while his skin sprouted feathers the size of warrior shields that gleamed with metallic bronze highlights in the morning sunlight. His eyes, already fierce in their giant form, became predatory orbs that burned with golden fire and possessed the acute vision necessary to spot prey from distances measured in leagues rather than mere miles. The wingspan that emerged from this metamorphosis stretched across a distance that could have sheltered a moderate-sized building, each individual feather crafted with the precision of a master weaponsmith, forging implements of war. The giant's eagle form possessed capabilities that transcended those of any natural bird, no matter how large or powerful. His talons, forged through magical transformation rather than biological growth, could crush stone and rend metal with equal ease, while his beak could pierce armour that would turn aside the finest mortal weapons. The magical nature of his transformation granted him supernatural strength that allowed him to carry loads that would challenge even the most powerful natural predators, making Idunn's comparatively slight form easily manageable despite her divine nature and the resistance she would inevitably offer once she realised the true nature of her situation. The moment of Thiazi's dramatic appearance marked the instant when Idunn's world transformed from scholarly expedition into nightmare beyond her most terrible imaginings. The enormous eagle burst from concealment with a thunderclap of wing beats that sent shockwaves through the surrounding forest, causing ancient trees to sway and smaller creatures to flee in panic from the overwhelming presence of apex predation. His approach generated winds strong enough to knock a mortal warrior from his feet, while his shadow blocked out the sun and cast the entire valley into temporary twilight that seemed to herald the approach of cosmic disaster. Loki's reaction to Thiazi's appearance required careful calibration to maintain his deception while ensuring that the giant could successfully complete his capture of Idunn without interference. The trickster god feigned surprise and alarm at the sudden appearance of the massive predator, his performance designed to convince Idunn that this encounter was as unexpected for him as it was terrifying for her. His apparent attempts to position himself between the goddess and the approaching eagle served the dual purpose of appearing protective, while actually manoeuvring Idunn into the optimal position for Thiazi's strike. The goddess's initial response to the giant eagle's appearance reflected both her divine nature and her lack of experience with direct physical threats. Her first instinct was to call upon the magical protections that surrounded her grove in Asgard, only to discover that these wards were tied to specific locations and could not be summoned in the wild territories of Midgard. Her attempts to use her control over the golden apples as a defensive measure proved equally futile, as the fruit's regenerative properties offered no protection against immediate physical danger from a predator of Thiazi's capabilities. Thiazi's capture technique demonstrated the calculated precision that had characterized his entire plan for acquiring control over Idunn and her precious apples. Rather than simply grasping the goddess in his talons and risking injury to his valuable prize through excessive pressure, the giant employed a more sophisticated approach that involved using his massive wings to create downdrafts that disrupted her balance while positioning his body to block any possible escape routes. His movements displayed the fluid coordination of a natural predator combined with the strategic intelligence of a being who had spent considerable time planning this exact sequence of actions. The moment when Thiazi's talons finally closed around Idunn's form marked the completion of the most audacious kidnapping in the history of the Nine Worlds. The giant's grip was calibrated to ensure complete control over his captive while avoiding the kind of crushing pressure that might damage the goddess, or interfere with her ability to tend the golden apples that were the true prize in this elaborate scheme. His talons formed a cage of bone and keratin around Idunn's body, each digit positioned to prevent any possibility of escape, while maintaining enough space for her to breathe and survive the journey to his mountain stronghold. The flight toward Jotunheim began with Thiazi's powerful wing beats, carrying both himself and his captive high above the forested valleys of Midgard, gaining altitude that would provide strategic advantages during the long journey to his prepared prison. The giant's aerial capabilities allowed him to travel at speeds that would make pursuit by ground-based rescuers impossible, while his intimate knowledge of air currents and weather patterns enabled him to choose flight paths that would minimize the risk of detection by Odin's ravens or other divine surveillance methods that might alert Asgard to Idunn's predicament. The landscape that passed beneath them during their flight toward giant territory reflected the gradual transition from the ordered realms influenced by divine power to the chaotic regions where primordial forces still held sway. Cultivated fields and human settlements gave way to increasingly wild terrain where massive geological formations suggested the presence of sleeping giants or the remnants of ancient battles between cosmic forces. The very air grew thicker and more oppressive as they travelled deeper into regions where the normal laws of physics bent under the influence of chaotic magic and the fundamental forces that had shaped the world during its earliest epochs. Idunn's experience during this terrifying journey combined physical discomfort with psychological trauma as she gradually realised the full scope of the disaster that had befallen her. The goddess found herself completely helpless within Thiazi's grasp, unable to employ any of her divine abilities to escape or summon aid from her fellow gods. The steady rhythm of the giant's wing beats and the rushing wind that surrounded them during flight created a sensory environment that disoriented her and made it difficult to maintain awareness of their direction or distance travelled. The giant's flight pattern incorporated deliberate variations in altitude and speed that served both practical and psychological purposes within his overall strategy for maintaining control over his captive. Sudden dives towards rocky outcroppings and equally abrupt climbs to oxygen-thin heights demonstrated his complete mastery over their shared aerial environment, while reinforcing Idunn's absolute dependence upon his continued cooperation for her survival. These displays of aerial dominance also served to exhaust the goddess mentally and physically, reducing her capacity for resistance or escape attempts once they reached their destination. The mountain stronghold that served as Thiazi's primary residence had been selected and modified, specifically to serve as a prison capable of holding even a divine captive. The structure occupied a series of interconnected caverns carved into a peak that rose above the surrounding landscape, like a stone spear thrust toward the sky, its sides too steep and smooth for climbing by any conventional means. The magical wards that protected the stronghold had been crafted through centuries of careful work, creating barriers that would prevent escape through shape-shifting, teleportation, or other supernatural means that might otherwise allow a divine prisoner to regain freedom. The interior chambers where Idunn would be confined reflected Thiazi's understanding of both her divine nature and the specific requirements for maintaining her ability to tend the golden apples that were his ultimate prize. The rooms were spacious enough to prevent the claustrophobic despair that might drive a captive to desperate measures, while being completely sealed against any possibility of unauthorized departure. Magical lighting provided illumination that mimicked the golden radiance of Asgard's eternal daylight, ensuring that the goddess would retain the environmental conditions necessary for her continued effectiveness as keeper of the miraculous fruit. The giant's motivations for undertaking this elaborate kidnapping scheme extended far beyond simple desire for immortality or youth, encompassing a comprehensive plan to fundamentally alter the balance of power between the ordered realm of Asgard and the chaotic forces of Jotunheim. Thiazi understood that control over Idunn and her apples would grant him leverage over the entire pantheon of Aesir gods, transforming him from a powerful but ultimately subordinate giant into a figure whose influence could reshape the cosmic order according to his own vision and desires. The strategic implications of Idunn's capture represented a masterstroke that exploited the fundamental weakness in Asgard's defensive posture. While the gods had developed sophisticated protections against direct military assault and had proven their ability to repel organized invasions by giant armies, they had never adequately prepared for the possibility that their most essential resource might be removed through deception and stealth. The kidnapping demonstrated how a single well-planned operation could accomplish what centuries of conventional warfare had failed to achieve. Thiazi's long-term plans for his divine captive involved more than simply extracting golden apples to ensure his own continued vitality and power. The giant envisioned establishing himself as the sole source of renewal for the Aesir, a position that would allow him to dictate terms to Odin himself and potentially restructure the entire relationship between gods and giants. His control over Idunn would transform every divine decision into a negotiation where the continued existence of the pantheon hung in the balance, granting him veto power over any action that might threaten his interests or ambitions. The psychological warfare that Thiazi planned to wage against the gods through his control over their source of renewal reflected his sophisticated understanding of divine psychology and the internal dynamics that governed Asgard's society. The giant recognized that the gradual aging and weakening of the gods would create internal tensions and conflicts as individual deities began to compete for access to whatever limited supplies of renewal might be available. These divisions would weaken the collective response to his demands while simultaneously demonstrating his power to grant or withhold the vitality that each god required for continued effectiveness. The broader cosmic implications of Idunn's imprisonment extended beyond immediate concerns about divine aging to encompass fundamental questions about the stability of the ordered reality that the gods work to maintain. The gradual weakening of the Aesir would inevitably reduce their ability to defend against the chaotic forces that constantly pressed against the boundaries of civilized existence, potentially accelerating the approach of Ragnarok and the final destruction of the current cosmic order. Thiazi's actions thus represented not merely an assault on individual gods, but an attack on the fundamental structure of reality itself. The first signs of Idunn's absence manifested within Asgard as subtle disruptions to the carefully maintained rhythms that had governed divine society for countless millennia. The goddess's failure to appear for the scheduled renewal ceremony sent ripples of unease through the golden halls, though initially her fellow gods attributed this unprecedented absence to some minor delay or temporary indisposition. The sacred grove where she tended her miraculous trees stood eerily silent, its crystalline barriers intact, but the vital presence that had always animated the space now conspicuously absent. The apple trees themselves seemed to sense their keeper's disappearance, their leaves beginning to curl at the edges and their golden fruit losing the subtle luminescence that had always marked their readiness for harvest. Bragi was the first to recognize that something fundamental had gone wrong with the cosmic order that sustained their divine existence. The god of poetry possessed an intimate understanding of his wife's habits and responsibilities that made him acutely sensitive to any deviation from her normal patterns of behavior. When Idunn failed to return from what Loki had described as a brief investigative expedition, Bragi's growing concern transformed into active alarm as he discovered that none of the other gods had been informed of her departure. His attempts to locate traces of her passage beyond Asgard's borders proved fruitless, as though she had simply vanished from existence without leaving any trail that even divine senses could follow. The absence of the renewal ceremony created immediate practical problems that extended beyond the god's personal need for the golden apple's rejuvenating properties. The divine community had structured its activities around the regular consumption of Idunn's fruit, with individual gods timing their most demanding endeavours to coincide with periods when their vitality would be at its peak following renewal. Thor's expeditions against giants and monsters, Odin's journeys to gather wisdom throughout the 9 worlds, and the various other activities that required peak divine performance all depended upon the predictable availability of the apple's regenerative effects. Within the first week of Idunn's disappearance, the gods began experiencing subtle changes in their physical condition that would have been imperceptible to mortal observation, but registered as deeply disturbing alterations to beings accustomed to absolute constancy in their divine forms. Odin noticed that his legendary stamina during long periods of meditation and study began to flag earlier than usual, requiring him to take breaks from activities that had previously sustained his attention for days or weeks without interruption. The Allfather's ravens, Hugin and Munin, reported that their master's responses to their intelligence reports lacked the sharp analytical precision that had always characterized his processing of information from across the 9 worlds. Thor's experience of gradual weakening proved particularly alarming given his role as the primary military defender of Asgard against external threats. The Thunder God discovered that wielding Mjolnir required marginally more effort than before, though the hammer's weight remained unchanged and its magical properties continued to function normally. His legendary appetite, which had always served as both practical necessity and source of entertainment during divine feasts, began to diminish as his metabolism started operating according to patterns that more closely resembled those of powerful but ultimately mortal beings rather than eternal gods. Frigg's deterioration manifested primarily through changes in her prophetic abilities and her capacity to maintain the complex magical workings that protected Asgard from various supernatural threats. The All-Mother had always possessed the ability to perceive potential futures with crystalline clarity, but now found her visions clouded by uncertainties and ambiguities that made accurate prediction increasingly difficult. Her attempts to use her foresight to locate Idunn or determine the cause of her disappearance produced only fragmentary impressions that seemed to shift and contradict themselves whenever she tried to focus on specific details. Heimdall, whose duties as guardian of the Bifrost required supernatural vigilance and sensory acuity, experienced the aging process as a gradual dimming of the extraordinary perceptual abilities that had always defined his divine nature. The Watchman of the Gods found that his legendary eyesight, which could previously detect movement across vast distances in any of the 9 worlds, now required more concentrated effort to achieve the same level of detail and clarity. His hearing, once capable of detecting whispered conversations in distant realms, began to require active focus rather than operating as an automatic background awareness of potential threats or significant events. The goddess Freya discovered that her mastery over the magical arts known as Cedar became increasingly taxing as her divine vitality slowly ebbed away. Spells that had once required minimal effort now demanded careful preparation and significant expenditure of energy, while complex magical workings that she'd previously accomplished through intuitive understanding began requiring conscious analysis and deliberate technique. Her ability to transform into her falcon shape, a capability she had used countless times for reconnaissance and rapid travel, now left her feeling drained and disoriented in ways that had never occurred during her previous millennia of divine existence. Balder, whose radiant beauty and inherent goodness had always served as symbols of divine perfection, experienced the aging process as a gradual dimming of the inner light that had made him beloved throughout the 9 worlds. His legendary charisma, which had previously allowed him to resolve conflicts through the sheer force of his presence and moral authority, now required conscious effort and carefully chosen words to achieve the same diplomatic results. The prophetic dreams that had always provided him with guidance about future events became less frequent and more difficult to interpret, leaving him feeling increasingly uncertain about the cosmic forces that shape divine destiny. The psychological impact of these physical changes proved even more devastating than the practical limitations they imposed on individual gods. The Aesir had existed for so long in states of unchanging perfection that they had developed deep-seated assumptions about their fundamental nature and their relationship to the cosmic order. The gradual recognition that they were subject to the same entropic forces that affected all other beings in the 9 worlds challenged their understanding of their own identity and their role as eternal guardians of civilized existence against the forces of chaos and destruction. The growing panic within Asgard manifested through increasingly desperate attempts to understand and reverse the aging process that threatened to reduce the gods to the status of powerful but ultimately mortal beings. Odin consulted the most ancient sources of wisdom available to him, seeking knowledge about the fundamental nature of divine existence and the magical principles that governed renewal and decay. His investigations revealed disturbing parallels between the gods' current condition and the mythological accounts of previous cosmic cycles where divine beings had gradually weakened and been replaced by newer generations of supernatural entities. The Allfather's attempts to use his mastery of runic magic to halt or reverse the aging process produced only temporary and partial results that served to highlight the magnitude of the crisis, rather than providing genuine solutions. Spells that should have restored youthful vigour instead provided brief periods of enhanced energy, followed by deeper exhaustion, while magical workings designed to halt the passage of time within divine bodies created painful tensions between their supernatural nature and the entropic forces that were gradually asserting dominance over their physical forms. Frigg organised systematic searches throughout all 9 worlds, dispatching trusted agents to investigate any location where Idunn might have been taken or where traces of her passage might be discovered. These expeditions employed both conventional reconnaissance methods and sophisticated magical techniques designed to detect even the faintest traces of divine presence or the unique magical signatures associated with the golden apples. The failure of these searches to produce any useful information about Idunn's whereabouts only intensified the growing sense of helplessness that pervaded Asgard's leadership. The social dynamics within the divine community began to shift as individual gods started experiencing different rates of aging based on their varying levels of stored vitality and their specific divine natures. Those gods who had consumed Idunn's apples most recently maintained their peak condition longer than those whose last renewal had occurred further in the past, creating subtle hierarchies based on remaining strength rather than traditional authority structures. These disparities generated tensions and resentments that had never previously existed within the generally harmonious society of Asgard. The younger gods, who had always deferred to their elders based on accumulated wisdom and experience, began to recognize that their own relatively recent consumption of the golden apples granted them temporary advantages in terms of physical capability and mental acuity. This reversal of traditional power relationships created confusion about decision-making authority and strategic planning, as gods who had never been responsible for major policy decisions found themselves among the most capable members of the divine community. The gradual weakening of the gods' defensive capabilities created vulnerabilities that did not go unnoticed by the various hostile forces that constantly probed Asgard's borders for signs of weakness or opportunity. Giant scouts reported unusual patterns of divine activity that suggested internal problems within the god's stronghold, while other chaotic entities began testing the magical barriers and protective wards that had previously seemed impregnable. The knowledge that the gods might be experiencing some form of crisis encouraged bolder actions by enemies who had previously maintained respectful distances from Asgard's sphere of influence. Loki's behaviour during this period of crisis provided additional cause for concern among the increasingly suspicious divine leadership. The trickster god's apparent guilt about his role in Idunn's disappearance manifested through uncharacteristic nervousness and evasive responses to questions about his recent activities. His attempts to deflect attention from his involvement in the goddess's fate became increasingly transparent as the other gods' desperation drove them to examine every possible explanation for their current predicament with microscopic attention to detail. The practical implications of divine aging extended beyond immediate concerns about individual capability to encompass fundamental questions about the gods' ability to maintain the cosmic order that depended upon their active intervention and protection. The various magical workings that kept the 9 worlds in stable relationship to each other required constant maintenance by divine beings operating at peak effectiveness. As the gods' capabilities diminished, these essential maintenance tasks became increasingly difficult to perform, creating the possibility of cascading failures that could destabilize the entire structure of organized reality. The agricultural cycles that sustained mortal populations throughout Midgard began showing signs of disruption, as the weakened gods proved less capable of maintaining the seasonal patterns that governed plant growth and animal reproduction. Freyr's diminished control over fertility and abundance resulted in crop yields that fell short of normal expectations, while Njord's reduced mastery over wind and weather created unpredictable storms and calm periods that interfered with maritime trade and fishing activities. These changes in natural patterns created hardships for mortal populations that depended upon divine protection and guidance for their survival and prosperity. The magical barriers that protected Asgard itself from direct assault by giant armies or other hostile forces began showing signs of strain as the gods who maintained them operated with reduced effectiveness. These defensive systems had been designed to function indefinitely under the assumption that their divine operators would maintain constant peak performance. But the gradual aging of the gods created gaps and weaknesses that had never been anticipated during the original construction of Asgard's fortifications. The realization that their condition would continue to deteriorate without access to Idunn's golden apples forced the gods to confront the possibility that their current crisis might represent the beginning of the end for their civilization and their role as guardians of cosmic order. The prospect of gradual decline into mortality, followed by death and replacement by unknown successors, challenged every assumption about divine nature and eternal responsibility that had guided their actions for countless millennia. The search for alternative sources of renewal became increasingly desperate as conventional magical methods proved inadequate to halt or reverse the aging process that threatened to transform the gods into shadows of their former selves. Ancient texts were consulted for references to other sources of divine vitality, while expeditions were organised to investigate rumours of magical artefacts or natural phenomena that might provide temporary relief from their deteriorating condition. These efforts consumed enormous amounts of the gods' remaining energy, while producing no practical results that could address their fundamental need for Idunn's unique gift. The mounting desperation within Asgard's golden halls reached a critical threshold when Odin finally acknowledged that conventional search methods had failed to locate any trace of Idunn or provide explanations for her unprecedented disappearance. The Allfather's decision to initiate a formal investigation marked a fundamental shift from hopeful expectation of the goddess's imminent return to grim acceptance that some malevolent force had deliberately removed her from the divine realm. The systematic inquiry that followed would employ every resource available to the gods, from Heimdall's supernatural perception to the most sophisticated magical detection techniques developed over millennia of divine governance. The investigation began with Heimdall's comprehensive surveillance of all possible routes leading away from Asgard, utilising his legendary sensory capabilities to examine every pathway through the 9 worlds for traces of Idunn's passage. The Guardian of the Bifrost positioned himself at the Rainbow Bridge's apex and extended his perception across vast distances, scrutinising landscapes from the icy wastes of Niflheim to the fiery realms of Muspelheim for any indication of divine presence or magical disturbance. His search revealed numerous signs of recent travel by various beings throughout the interconnected worlds, but none of these traces carried the distinctive magical signature associated with the Keeper of the Golden Apples. Odin's ravens, Hugin and Munin, received explicit instructions to expand their normal intelligence-gathering activities into a focused search for information about Idunn's whereabouts. The 2 birds, whose daily flights carried them across all 9 worlds to observe and report on significant events, began conducting detailed investigations of locations where the goddess might have been taken or where evidence of her captivity might be discovered. Their reports described numerous giant strongholds and hidden fortresses throughout Jotunheim, but none showed signs of recent divine captivity or the magical emanations that would indicate the presence of the golden apples. Frigg employed her prophetic abilities in increasingly desperate attempts to penetrate the supernatural concealment that surrounded Idunn's fate. The All-Mother's visions, normally crystalline in their clarity and comprehensive in their scope, encountered strange barriers and distortions whenever she tried to focus on events related to the missing goddess. These magical obstructions suggested deliberate interference by someone with intimate knowledge of divine prophetic techniques and the specific methods required to block or mislead supernatural foresight. The systematic nature of this concealment indicated planning and preparation that extended far beyond opportunistic kidnapping. The magical investigation conducted by Freya and other gods skilled in the mystical arts revealed disturbing evidence of deception within Asgard itself. Traces of shape-shifting magic were discovered along the paths leading to Idunn's grove, indicating that someone had assumed false forms while approaching the sacred orchard. The magical signatures associated with these transformations bore characteristics that seemed familiar yet somehow altered, as though a known practitioner had deliberately modified their techniques to avoid immediate recognition. These findings suggested that Idunn's disappearance had been facilitated by someone with authorized access to her domain and detailed knowledge of her daily routines. The systematic questioning of every god and divine servant who had interacted with Idunn during the days preceding her disappearance, produced a growing body of evidence that pointed toward internal betrayal. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the goddess in conversation with Loki during the period immediately before her vanishing, though the trickster god's explanations of these encounters seemed increasingly evasive and contradictory under sustained interrogation. His claims about routine discussions of horticultural matters and casual exchanges of information about travel conditions failed to account for the unusual intensity and secrecy that several observers had noted in their interactions. Bragi's intimate knowledge of his wife's character and habits provided crucial insights that helped focus the investigation on specific inconsistencies in the accounts provided by potential suspects. The god of poetry pointed out that Idunn would never have undertaken any journey related to her professional responsibilities without first consulting him or other knowledgeable gods about the wisdom and safety of such an expedition. Her legendary caution regarding anything that might affect the security of the golden apples made it virtually impossible that she would have departed Asgard based solely on second-hand reports of superior fruit discovered in distant realms. The reconstruction of events leading to Idunn's disappearance revealed a pattern of manipulation that bore all the hallmarks of Loki's particular expertise in psychological deception. The careful timing of his approach to the goddess, the specific nature of the false information he had provided, and the elaborate justifications he had offered for secrecy all demonstrated the kind of sophisticated planning that characterized the trickster god's most successful schemes. The realization that one of their own had orchestrated this catastrophe sent shockwaves through the divine community that exceeded even their horror at Idunn's absence. Odin's confrontation with Loki took place in the All-Father's private hall, where the accumulated evidence of treachery could be presented without the distractions and emotional complications that would have accompanied a public accusation. The All-Father's approach to this interrogation reflected both his desperate need for information about Idunn's location and his profound disappointment at discovering betrayal from someone he had trusted despite numerous previous incidents of questionable judgment. The weight of divine aging that had begun to affect even Odin himself lent additional urgency to the proceedings, as every day of delay brought the gods closer to irreversible decline. The evidence presented against Loki included detailed magical analysis of the deceptive traces found near Idunn's grove, testimony from multiple witnesses about his suspicious behaviour, and logical reconstruction of the methods that would have been necessary to convince the cautious goddess to leave Asgard without proper authorization. The systematic nature of this evidence made denial impossible, though Loki's initial responses attempted to deflect responsibility by suggesting alternative explanations for the circumstantial connections that linked him to Idunn's disappearance. Heimdall's testimony proved particularly damaging to Loki's attempts at maintaining innocence, as the Guardian's supernatural perception had detected subtle magical emanations consistent with shape-shifting in locations where Loki claimed never to have been present. The Watchman's ability to perceive across vast distances and through various forms of concealment made his observations virtually impossible to dispute, while his legendary honesty and reliability eliminated any possibility that his testimony might be motivated by personal animosity rather than objective observation. The magical examination of Loki himself revealed traces of giant magic that could not be explained by his normal activities or his known associations with various supernatural entities throughout the 9 worlds. These magical signatures suggested recent contact with powerful giant sorcery of a type specifically associated with coercion and binding, indicating that the trickster god might himself have been subjected to supernatural compulsion. However, this discovery raised as many questions as it answered, since Loki's considerable magical abilities should have provided adequate protection against most forms of external influence. Thor's participation in the interrogation brought a more direct and physically intimidating element to the proceedings, as the thunder god's growing weakness from divine aging had done nothing to diminish his legendary temper or his protective instincts regarding his fellow gods. his questions focused on practical matters of location and timing, demanding specific details about where Idunn had been taken and what methods might be employed to secure her release. The combination of Thor's barely controlled rage and his diminishing patience created an atmosphere of immediate physical threat that added considerable pressure to Loki's increasingly desperate situation. The revelation of Thiazi's involvement emerged gradually as Loki's resistance to questioning began to crumble under the weight of accumulated evidence, and the growing realization that his fellow gods possessed both the determination and the investigative capabilities necessary to uncover the complete truth about his actions. The trickster god's admission that he'd been coerced by the giant represented a crucial breakthrough in understanding the scope and sophistication of the plot against Idunn, while simultaneously raising new questions about the methods employed to overcome Loki's normally formidable defences against external manipulation. The details of Loki's capture and coercion by Thiazi provided important intelligence about the giant's capabilities and his strategic approach to acquiring leverage over the gods. The magical binding that had connected Loki to the giant's eagle form demonstrated techniques that exceeded the normal capabilities associated with shape-shifting magic, suggesting access to ancient knowledge or supernatural assistance from sources beyond the typical resources available to individual giants. This information forced the gods to reassess their understanding of the threats they faced and the sophistication of their enemies' capabilities. The geographic information extracted from Loki about Thiazi's mountain stronghold provided the first concrete leads about Idunn's probable location since the investigation had begun. The trickster god's descriptions of the giant's aerial approach routes, the defensive characteristics of his fortress, and the magical wards protecting his domain gave the gods essential intelligence for planning a rescue operation. However, this information also revealed the formidable challenges that would face any attempt to recover Idunn through direct assault or conventional military action. The gods' reaction to the full revelation of Loki's betrayal encompassed a complex mixture of rage, disappointment, and desperate calculation about the most effective response to their current crisis. The personal betrayal represented by Loki's actions struck particularly deeply because of his long history as a trusted member of their community and his intimate knowledge of their individual vulnerabilities and collective dependencies. The realization that someone with such detailed understanding of their society had chosen to exploit that knowledge for personal survival created profound questions about trust and security within their previously harmonious community. Odin's response to the confirmed treachery reflected his dual role as both injured party and strategic leader, responsible for the welfare of all gods under his authority. The All-Father's legendary wisdom enabled him to recognize that revenge against Loki, however personally satisfying, would serve no practical purpose in recovering Idunn or addressing the immediate crisis facing the divine community. His focus shifted immediately from punishment to practical problem-solving, though his cold fury at the betrayal remained visible beneath his calculated approach to crisis management. The ultimatum delivered to Loki represented both punishment for his treachery and the gods' best hope for recovering their essential source of renewal before their deteriorating condition rendered them incapable of effective action. These specific terms demanded that the trickster god use his shape-shifting abilities and his knowledge of Thiazi's stronghold to infiltrate the giant's fortress and return Idunn to Asgard within a time frame that would prevent irreversible aging among the divine community. The implicit threat underlying this demand was that failure to succeed would result in punishments that would make Thiazi's previous torment seem mild by comparison. The practical challenges involved in Loki's assigned mission extended far beyond simple infiltration and rescue, encompassing the need to overcome magical defences specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of operation he was being ordered to undertake. Thiazi's fortress had been constructed and warded with the assumption that the gods might eventually discover Idunn's location and attempt her recovery, meaning that the giant had prepared countermeasures against shapeshifting, teleportation, and other supernatural techniques that might be employed in rescue operations. The time pressure associated with Loki's mission created additional complications that would affect every aspect of his planning and execution. The god's continued aging meant that delays in recovering Idunn would result in progressively diminished divine capabilities for supporting the rescue operation or defending against potential retaliation from Thiazi and his allies. The trickster god found himself facing a situation where success required not merely overcoming formidable obstacles, but doing so within a time frame that was rapidly shrinking as his fellow gods grew weaker with each passing day. The broader implications of the investigation's findings extended beyond immediate concerns about Idunn's rescue to encompass fundamental questions about security and vulnerability within Asgard's society. The ease with which Thiazi had exploited existing relationships and trust patterns to achieve his goals demonstrated weaknesses in the god's defensive posture that would require systematic reform to prevent similar incidents in the future. The recognition that their greatest vulnerabilities might come from within their own community rather than from external enemies represented a paradigm shift that would influence divine policy and personal relationships for generations to come. The weight of divine judgment fell upon Loki like the crushing force of a mountain avalanche, as Odin's ultimatum echoed through the crystalline halls of Asgard. The trickster god found himself confronting the most perilous mission of his existence, one that would require him to infiltrate the heavily fortified stronghold of a giant whose magical capabilities had already proven superior to his own defensive measures. The irony of his situation was not lost on him. The very betrayal that had secured his temporary freedom from Thiazi's mountain prison had now trapped him in an even more desperate circumstance, where failure would result in consequences far worse than mere physical torment. Freya's falcon cloak represented the most sophisticated piece of shape-shifting magic available within Asgard's arsenal, a garment woven from feathers that had been harvested during the goddess's own transformations and imbued with centuries of accumulated magical energy. The cloak's construction involved techniques that predated the current generation of gods, incorporating knowledge from the earliest practitioners of cedar magic who had understood the fundamental principles governing the relationship between consciousness and physical form. Each feather contained crystallized essence of flight itself, allowing the wearer to assume not merely the appearance of a falcon, but the complete sensory experience and instinctive knowledge that characterized these supreme aerial predators. The process of donning the falcon cloak required careful preparation, both physical and mental, as the transformation it enabled operated at levels far deeper than conventional shape-shifting magic. Loki spent precious hours studying the garment's construction and attuning his consciousness to the magical frequencies that would govern his transformed state. The cloak responded to his touch with subtle warmth that indicated its acceptance of his worthiness to employ its power, though he remained acutely aware that this borrowed magic would never provide the same intuitive mastery that Freya herself possessed through centuries of practice and natural affinity. The transformation began the moment the cloak settled across Loki's shoulders, its magical properties immediately initiating changes that cascaded through every aspect of his physical form. His bones hollowed and lightened while maintaining their structural integrity through supernatural reinforcement that eliminated the normal trade-offs between weight and strength that characterized natural avian anatomy. His vision sharpened and expanded to encompass electromagnetic spectra invisible to most creatures, while his hearing became attuned to the subtle air currents and pressure variations that would guide his flight through even the most challenging atmospheric conditions. The sensation of wings sprouting from his transformed body brought with it a flood of instinctive knowledge about aerial navigation that had been encoded within the cloak's magical structure. Loki found himself understanding wind patterns and thermal currents with the same intuitive grasp that he normally applied to the intricacies of deception and psychological manipulation. His new form possessed reflexes and spatial awareness that operated faster than conscious thought, allowing him to make split-second adjustments to wing position and flight angle that would have required careful calculation in his normal state. The departure from Asgard took place under cover of the eternal twilight that preceded the dawn hours, when the golden radiance of the divine realm reached its lowest ebb and provided optimal concealment for activities that required discretion. Loki launched himself from the highest spire of Gladsheim, his falcon form catching the air currents with practiced ease despite his recent acquisition of this shape. The sensation of flight proved intoxicating even under his desperate circumstances, as the cloak's magic granted him access to experiences that transcended the limitations of ground-bound existence. The journey toward Jotunheim required navigation through atmospheric layers where competing magical influences created turbulence and distortion that challenged even supernatural flight capabilities. The boundary regions between the 9 worlds generated updrafts and downdrafts that could dash unwary flyers against mountain peaks or carry them far off course into regions where hostile entities maintained territorial control. Loki's transformed senses detected these hazards with crystalline clarity, allowing him to plot flight paths that avoided the most dangerous atmospheric phenomena while maintaining the speed necessary to reach Thiazi's stronghold before his fellow god's condition deteriorated beyond recovery. The landscape that passed beneath his wings during the flight toward giant territory revealed the gradual transition from ordered divine influence to the chaotic forces that characterize the primordial realms. Geometric patterns in agricultural fields and settlement layouts gave way to irregular formations where geological processes operated according to their own logic rather than divine guidance. The very air grew thicker and more oppressive as he travelled deeper into regions where the fundamental laws of physics bent under the influence of giant magic and the elemental forces that had shaped the world during its earliest epochs. Thiazi's mountain fortress occupied a peak that rose from the surrounding landscape like a stone monument to giant engineering and magical craftsmanship. The structure's design incorporated both natural rock formations and deliberately constructed fortifications that created a defensive complex capable of withstanding assault by armies or individual heroes of legendary capability. Massive walls carved from the living stone of the mountain itself enclosed courtyards and towers that commanded views across vast distances, while magical barriers shimmered with barely visible energy that indicated sophisticated protective wards designed to repel various forms of supernatural intrusion. The approach to the fortress required careful reconnaissance to identify potential weaknesses in its defensive perimeter and locate entry points that might allow infiltration without triggering the magical alarms that undoubtedly protected the structure. Loki's falcon form provided optimal capabilities for this surveillance mission, as his enhanced vision could detect subtle variations in magical energy that indicated gaps or vulnerabilities in the protective barriers. His aerial mobility allowed him to observe the fortress from multiple angles and altitudes, building a comprehensive understanding of its layout and defensive systems. The magical wards surrounding Thiazi's stronghold demonstrated sophistication that exceeded Loki's initial expectations, incorporating multiple layers of protection that addressed different categories of potential threats. The outermost barriers were designed to detect and repel large-scale assaults by divine armies or individual gods operating at full power, while inner defensive systems focused on preventing infiltration by shapeshifters, spies, and other covert operatives. The integration of these various protective measures created overlapping fields of magical energy that would challenge even the most skilled practitioners of supernatural stealth. The discovery of Idunn's prison location within the fortress complex required patient observation of activity patterns and magical emanations that might indicate the presence of divine captivity. Loki's enhanced senses detected subtle distortions in the ambient magical field that suggested the presence of powerful divine essence contained within one of the fortress's central towers. The specific characteristics of these magical signatures matched his memories of Idunn's distinctive aura, confirming that the goddess remained alive and presumably capable of tending her golden apples despite her imprisonment. The tower that served as Idunn's prison had been constructed with specific attention to the requirements for containing a divine being, while maintaining the environmental conditions necessary for her continued effectiveness as keeper of the miraculous fruit. Magical lighting provided illumination that mimicked the golden radiance of Asgard's eternal daylight, while climate control systems maintained temperature and humidity levels optimal for both divine comfort and apple cultivation. The chamber's design reflected Thiazi's understanding that his prize would lose value if allowed to deteriorate through inadequate care or psychological despair. The infiltration of the fortress required Loki to exploit weaknesses in the defensive systems that had been designed primarily to repel direct assault, rather than subtle penetration by creatures capable of flight. His falcon form allowed him to approach through aerial routes that ground-based defences could not adequately monitor, while his small size enabled him to slip through gaps in the magical barriers that would have blocked larger intruders. The timing of his approach coincided with periods when the fortress's magical defences operated at reduced intensity, taking advantage of natural fluctuations in the power sources that sustained the protective wards. The moment of entry into Idunn's prison chamber marked the culmination of the most dangerous infiltration mission ever undertaken within the Nine Worlds. Loki's falcon form allowed him to slip through ventilation openings that had been designed to provide fresh air circulation without creating security vulnerabilities, though even these narrow passages required careful navigation to avoid triggering magical sensors that monitored for unauthorized intrusion. His enhanced hearing detected the subtle sounds of Idunn's movement within the chamber, confirming her presence and providing guidance for locating her exact position within the tower's complex internal layout. The goddess's condition after weeks of captivity revealed both her remarkable resilience and the psychological toll of imprisonment far from her beloved grove and the divine community she had served for millennia. Idunn appeared physically unharmed but displayed signs of the spiritual exhaustion that affected divine beings when separated from their essential purposes and familiar environments. Her golden apples, carefully maintained despite her circumstances, retained their magical properties but showed subtle signs of diminished potency that reflected their keeper's emotional state and her separation from the cosmic forces that normally sustain their power. The magical transformation of Idunn into a nut for transport during the escape represented one of the most sophisticated applications of shape-shifting magic ever attempted, requiring precise control over the fundamental forces that governed the relationship between consciousness and physical form. Loki's technique involved temporarily compressing the goddess's divine essence into a form that would retain all essential characteristics while occupying minimal physical space and weight. The process required Idunn's cooperation and trust, as resistance to the transformation could have resulted in permanent damage to her divine nature or complete failure of the magical working. The compression magic employed in this transformation operated according to principles that transcended normal understanding of physical matter and spatial relationships. Idunn's consciousness remained intact and aware throughout the process, though her ability to interact with the external world became severely limited by her reduced physical form. The magical shell that contained her essence was designed to protect against physical damage and magical interference, while maintaining the subtle connections to cosmic forces that sustained her divine nature and her ability to tend the golden apples upon her restoration to normal form. The escape from Thiazi's fortress began with Loki's careful navigation through the same ventilation passages that had provided access to Idunn's prison chamber, though the return journey carried additional risks due to the precious cargo he now transported. His falcon form's natural agility and supernatural enhancement provided by Freya's cloak allowed him to maneuver through narrow spaces while maintaining the steady flight patterns necessary to prevent damage to the magically transformed goddess. The timing of his departure coincided with periods of minimal guard activity, taking advantage of the fortress's daily rhythms to maximize his chances of escaping without detection. The detection of the escape triggered immediate activation of Thiazi's most sophisticated pursuit systems, as magical alarms throughout the fortress announced the unauthorized departure of the giant's most valuable prisoner. The defensive systems that had been designed to prevent infiltration proved equally effective at tracking and pursuing escaping intruders, generating magical emanations that allowed Thiazi to monitor Loki's flight path and coordinate his response accordingly. The giant's transformation into his massive eagle form occurred with practiced speed that demonstrated his extensive preparation for exactly this contingency. The aerial pursuit that followed represented a contest between supernatural flight capabilities operating at the absolute limits of their respective magical systems. Thiazi's eagle form possessed advantages in raw speed and endurance that reflected his enormous size and the primordial magic that sustained his shape-shifting abilities, while Loki's falcon form offered superior maneuverability and the benefit of Freya's accumulated magical enhancements. The chase stretched across vast distances as both participants pushed their transformed bodies beyond normal operational parameters in their desperate race toward Asgard's borders. The symbolic significance of Loki's rescue mission extended far beyond its immediate practical importance to encompass fundamental questions about redemption and the possibility of atonement for acts of betrayal that had threatened the existence of the divine community. The trickster god's willingness to risk his life in attempting to undo the consequences of his treachery represented a form of moral courage that had rarely characterized his previous actions, suggesting the possibility of genuine transformation in his relationship with his fellow gods and his understanding of his responsibilities within their society. The psychological transformation that Loki experienced during his desperate flight toward Asgard reflected the profound impact of confronting the full consequences of his betrayal and recognizing the extent to which his actions had endangered beings he'd come to regard as family despite their frequent conflicts and disagreements. The weight of Idunn's compressed form served as a constant physical reminder of the trust that had been placed in his ability to succeed where conventional rescue operations would have failed, while the sounds of Thiazi's pursuit provided urgent motivation for maintaining maximum speed despite the growing exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm his borrowed magical abilities. The moment Thiazi discovered Idunn's absence from her prison chamber, the entire mountain fortress erupted into supernatural chaos as ancient magical systems designed for exactly this contingency sprang into immediate action. Crystalline formations embedded within the fortress walls began pulsing with crimson light that cast dancing shadows throughout the stone corridors, while resonant tones that could shatter mortal bones echoed from hidden chambers where the giant had installed detection apparatus capable of tracking divine essence across vast distances. The magical network that monitored every corner of his domain instantly identified the direction of Loki's escape and began feeding precise navigational data directly into Thiazi's consciousness, through mystical connections that had taken centuries to establish and perfect. The giant's transformation from his humanoid form into the massive eagle that had originally captured Loki demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of a predator who had spent millennia perfecting his hunting techniques. His bones restructured themselves with audible cracking sounds that reverberated through the fortress chambers, while his flesh rippled and expanded as supernatural forces reshaped his anatomy according to avian specifications that exceeded anything found in natural creation. The wingspan that emerged from this metamorphosis stretched across dimensions that could have sheltered entire buildings, each individual feather forged through magical processes that granted them the hardness of tempered steel while maintaining the aerodynamic properties necessary for flight at speeds that challenge the fundamental laws governing atmospheric movement. Thiazi's eagle eyes, already formidable in their giant form, transformed into organs of perception that could detect movement across distances measured in leagues rather than mere miles. The magical enhancement of his vision allowed him to perceive electromagnetic spectra, invisible to other creatures, while his supernatural hearing became attuned to the specific frequency signatures associated with divine essence and the particular magical emanations produced by Freya's falcon cloak. These enhanced senses provided him with tracking capabilities that made concealment virtually impossible for any fleeing prey, regardless of their supernatural abilities or the sophisticated magical protections they might employ. The initial moments of pursuit reveal the enormous disparity between the two shapeshifted beings in terms of raw physical capability and magical endurance. Thiazi's massive form generated tremendous thrust through wing beats that created pressure waves capable of flattening trees and displacing boulders, while his supernatural constitution allowed him to maintain maximum speed indefinitely without experiencing the fatigue that would eventually limit any creature dependent upon biological energy sources. His flight path carved through the atmosphere with the precision of a guided projectile, following trajectories that eliminated unnecessary distance while accounting for wind patterns and atmospheric conditions that might affect his quarry's movement. Loki's falcon form, despite the considerable magical enhancements provided by Freya's cloak, operated under physical limitations that became increasingly apparent as the chase progressed across the hostile landscape of Jotunheim. The borrowed magic that sustained his transformation required constant energy expenditure that gradually depleted his reserves, while the additional burden of carrying Idunn in her compressed form created aerodynamic challenges that affected his maneuverability and maximum speed. The psychological pressure of knowing that failure would doom both himself and the goddess to fates worse than death added mental strain that compounded the physical demands of maintaining flight at the absolute limits of his capabilities. The terrain over which the aerial chase unfolded presented obstacles and hazards that transformed the pursuit into a three-dimensional maze, requiring split-second navigation decisions that could mean the difference between escape and capture. Jagged mountain peaks thrust upward like spear points designed to impale unwary flyers, while deep canyons yawned below like hungry mouths waiting to swallow creatures that lost altitude through exhaustion or miscalculation. The chaotic geography of giant territory reflected the primordial forces that had shaped this realm during the earliest epochs of creation, creating a landscape where natural laws operated according to principles that defied conventional understanding of physics and spatial relationships. Magical phenomena scattered throughout the region added layers of complexity to the chase that required both participants to constantly adjust their flight patterns to avoid supernatural hazards that could prove more dangerous than any physical obstacle. Zones of temporal distortion created areas where time moved at different rates, threatening to trap unwary travellers in accelerated aging or temporal loops that would prevent them from ever reaching their intended destinations. Pockets of concentrated chaotic energy generated unpredictable effects that could transform matter at the molecular level, or create gravitational anomalies that pulled flying creatures off course and into collision with solid surfaces. The psychological warfare that Thiazi employed during the pursuit demonstrated his sophisticated understanding of fear and desperation as tools for wearing down his quarry's resistance and forcing mistakes that would create opportunities for capture. The giant's flight pattern incorporated sudden accelerations and course changes designed to create the impression that capture was imminent, followed by calculated retreats that gave false hope of escape before resuming maximum pursuit speed. These tactics were intended to exhaust Loki's mental resources as thoroughly as his physical capabilities, creating conditions where panic might override rational decision-making and lead to fatal errors in navigation or magical technique. The giant's vocalizations during the chase carried across vast distances through supernatural amplification that allowed his voice to reach his fleeing quarry, regardless of atmospheric conditions or intervening obstacles. His words combined threats of terrible punishment with mockery of Loki's apparent desperation and the futility of attempting to escape from a predator whose capabilities so obviously exceeded those of his prey. The psychological impact of these taunts was carefully calculated to undermine Loki's confidence and create doubt about his ability to successfully complete the rescue mission that represented the only hope for preventing divine catastrophe in Asgard. The magical techniques that both participants employed during their aerial contest revealed the full extent of shape-shifting capabilities when pushed beyond normal, operational limits by life or death circumstances. Loki's falcon form began incorporating modifications that exceeded the standard parameters of Freya's cloak, as desperate necessity drove him to experiment with dangerous variations that could enhance his speed and maneuverability at the cost of potentially catastrophic magical feedback. His wings developed additional joint articulations that allowed more precise control over air currents, while his internal anatomy restructured itself to maximize oxygen efficiency and reduce the metabolic costs of sustained high-speed flight. Thiazi's eagle form similarly began displaying capabilities that transcended normal shape-shifting magic, as the giant drew upon reserves of primordial power that connected him directly to the fundamental forces that had shaped the cosmos during its creation. His feathers began generating their own lift through magical processes that supplemented conventional aerodynamics, while his bones became infused with crystallized essence of flight itself that eliminated weight considerations without sacrificing structural integrity. The magical field that surrounded his transformed body created a zone of altered physics where normal atmospheric resistance ceased to apply, allowing him to achieve speeds that should have been impossible for any creature dependent upon conventional flight mechanics. The distance between pursuer and prey fluctuated throughout the chase, as varying atmospheric conditions and terrain features created temporary advantages for one participant or the other. Thermal updrafts rising from sun-heated rock formations provided additional lift that allowed Loki's smaller form to gain altitude and speed without expending precious magical energy, while downdrafts in mountain valleys threatened to dash him against unforgiving stone surfaces if his reflexes proved inadequate to the challenge of maintaining controlled flight. Thiazi's massive form proved better suited to powering through adverse conditions through brute force, though his size occasionally worked against him in narrow passages where maneuverability became more important than raw speed. The gradual approach toward Asgard's borders created new tactical considerations, as both participants recognized that the chase was entering its final phase. The magical barriers that protected the divine realm from unauthorized intrusion operated according to principles that would affect each shape-shifted being differently, potentially creating opportunities for escape or final capture depending upon the specific timing and approach vectors employed. Loki's status as a recognized member of Asgard's community would allow him to pass through the protective wards without triggering defensive responses, while Thiazi's hostile intentions would activate countermeasures designed to repel exactly the kind of assault he represented. The other god's preparation for the climactic confrontation began the moment Heimdall's supernatural perception detected the approaching aerial chase and identified the participants through their distinctive magical signatures. The Guardian of the Bifrost immediately alerted Odin and the other members of Asgard's leadership, providing detailed intelligence about the speed and trajectory of both flyers, along with tactical assessments of their relative capabilities and likely arrival times. This advance warning allowed the gods to organize defensive measures that would maximize their chances of ensuring Loki's successful return, while preventing Thiazi from achieving his goal of recapturing Idunn or inflicting punishment upon the trickster god who had dared to steal his prize. The construction of the great fire trap that would ultimately determine the outcome of this aerial contest required the combined magical expertise of multiple gods working in unprecedented coordination, despite their weakened condition from prolonged absence of Idunn's golden apples. Thor contributed his mastery over lightning and electrical forces to create ignition systems that would function reliably under the extreme conditions anticipated during the confrontation. Freya provided knowledge of combustion magic that would ensure maximum heat generation from available fuel sources, while Freya's expertise in transformation magic helped design containment fields that would focus the fire's energy precisely where it would prove most effective against their giant adversary. The fuel for this massive conflagration consisted of specially prepared materials that had been gathered from throughout Asgard's domain and treated with magical processes that would enhance their burning characteristics far beyond anything achievable through conventional methods. Sacred woods from Yggdrasil's branches provided the foundation for a fire that would burn with supernatural intensity, while oils extracted from various magical plants created accelerants that would ensure rapid ignition and sustained combustion even under adverse weather conditions. The addition of powdered metals and crystallized magical essences created a mixture that would generate temperatures capable of affecting even supernatural beings, whose normal resilience made them virtually immune to conventional fire. The positioning of this trap required careful calculation of flight trajectories and approach vectors that would guide both participants toward the optimal location for maximizing the fire's effectiveness while minimizing the risk to Loki and his precious cargo. The gods arranged the combustible materials in patterns that would create focused streams of superheated air, designed to intercept Thiazi's flight path, without endangering the smaller falcon form that would hopefully pass through the area moments before the trap's activation. Backup ignition systems were positioned at multiple locations to ensure that mechanical failure or magical interference could not prevent the trap from functioning when the critical moment arrived. The timing mechanisms that would control the trap's activation incorporated both magical and mechanical elements designed to provide precise coordination, despite the enormous stresses and supernatural interference that would characterize the final moments of the chase. Heimdall's supernatural perception would provide real-time tracking data that would allow the gods to monitor both participants' exact positions and speeds, while magical communication systems would relay this information to the operators responsible for triggering the ignition sequence at the optimal moment. The margin for error in this timing was measured in fractions of seconds, as premature activation would endanger Loki, while delayed activation would allow Thiazi to escape the trap's effective range. The psychological preparation of the gods for this desperate gambit involved confronting the possibility that their plan might fail and result in the loss of both Loki and Idunn, effectively dooming their civilization to gradual decline and eventual extinction. The weight of this responsibility fell particularly heavily upon Odin, whose decision to authorize the rescue mission and the subsequent trap had placed the fate of the entire divine community upon the outcome of a single tactical operation. The All-Father's legendary wisdom provided no guarantees of success in a situation where so many variables lay beyond divine control, forcing him to rely upon hope and determination rather than the careful calculation that normally characterized his strategic decisions. The final approach of the aerial chase toward Asgard's walls created a crescendo of tension as the gods watched their carefully laid plans approach the moment of ultimate testing. Loki's falcon form appeared first on the horizon, his flight pattern displaying the erratic characteristics of extreme exhaustion, as Freya's cloak struggled to maintain the magical processes necessary for continued transformation and flight. The precious burden he carried remained safely compressed within its protective magical shell, though the strain of maintaining both the shape-shifting magic and the transformation spell that concealed Idunn was clearly approaching the limits of his capabilities. Thiazi's massive eagle form dominated the sky behind his fleeing quarry, his wingspan casting shadows that darkened the landscape below as he closed the remaining distance through sheer determination and supernatural endurance. The giant's pursuit had taken on characteristics of obsessive fury that transcended rational calculation of risk and reward, as his pride and his investment in the kidnapping scheme drove him to continue the chase even into the heart of enemy territory, where the gods possessed every possible advantage. His magical senses detected the presence of the trap that awaited him, but his commitment to recapturing his prize overrode the caution that might have prompted a more strategic retreat. The moment when Loki crossed the threshold of Asgard's defensive perimeter marked the beginning of the final phase of the rescue operation, as the god's trap moved from preparation into active execution. The ignition systems activated with perfect synchronization, sending cascades of magical fire erupting skyward in columns that reached toward the heavens like grasping fingers of divine wrath. The supernatural flames burned with colours that had no names in any mortal language, generating heat that warped the very fabric of space around the combustion zone and created thermal updrafts that could lift entire buildings into the air. Thiazi's realization that he'd flown directly into a carefully prepared ambush came too late to allow for evasive action, as his enormous momentum and the confined space available for maneuvering made escape impossible once he'd committed to his final approach vector. The giant's eagle form plunged directly into the heart of the magical conflagration, his supernatural resilience providing only momentary protection against flames that had been specifically designed to affect beings of his power and magical composition. The fire's intensity exceeded even his considerable defensive capabilities, as the combined magical expertise of multiple gods had created a weapon capable of challenging the fundamental forces that sustained his existence. The death of Thiazi represented more than the elimination of a single enemy, encompassing the destruction of one of the most powerful giants in Jotunheim and the removal of a strategic threat that had possessed both the capability and the motivation to fundamentally alter the balance of power between order and chaos throughout the Nine Worlds. The giant's demise in the flames created magical reverberations that would be felt throughout the cosmic structure, as his connection to primordial forces meant that his destruction affected the fundamental patterns of energy that flowed between different realms of existence. The successful rescue of Idunn marked the culmination of the most desperate gambit ever undertaken by the gods of Asgard, demonstrating both the extent of their vulnerability when separated from essential resources and their capacity for coordinated action, even under the most dire circumstances. The goddess's safe return to her grove and the restoration of her ability to tend the golden apples would reverse the aging process that had threatened to reduce the gods to mortal status, while the elimination of Thiazi removed the immediate threat that had prompted this crisis. The broader implications of these events extended far beyond the immediate resolution of the kidnapping crisis to encompass fundamental changes in the relationships between gods and giants throughout the Nine Worlds. Thiazi's death would inevitably provoke responses from other giants who had viewed him as a leader and protector, while the demonstration of the gods' willingness and ability to eliminate threats through coordinated magical warfare would influence future calculations about the risks and benefits of challenging Asgard's authority. The flames that consumed Thiazi had barely begun to cool when Loki's falcon form collapsed onto the golden stones of Asgard's courtyard, his borrowed magical strength finally exhausted by the tremendous ordeal of infiltration, escape, and the desperate flight that had brought him home. The transformation back to his normal shape occurred in stages, as Freya's cloak gradually released its hold on his consciousness and allowed his divine essence to resume its familiar form. The precious cargo he had carried throughout the harrowing journey remained safely compressed within its protective magical shell, though the strain of maintaining both shape-shifting magic and the transformation spell that concealed Idunn had pushed even his considerable abilities to their absolute limits. The restoration of Idunn to her natural form required the combined magical expertise of several gods working in careful coordination to reverse the compression enchantment without causing damage to her divine essence or her connection to the golden apples that defined her cosmic role. Freya led this delicate process, her mastery of transformation magic providing the precise control necessary to gradually expand the compressed consciousness back to its full divine proportions. Odin contributed his knowledge of fundamental magical principles to ensure that the restoration maintained the proper relationship between Idunn's physical form and her spiritual essence, while Frigg employed her prophetic abilities to monitor the process and detect any complications that might require immediate intervention. The moment when Idunn's eyes opened and her familiar form solidified within the circle of anxious gods marked the end of the most dangerous crisis Asgard had ever faced. The goddess appeared physically unharmed by her ordeal, though the psychological impact of weeks of imprisonment and the trauma of magical compression had left subtle marks that would require time and care to fully heal. Her first conscious act was to reach out with her divine senses toward her sacred grove, reassuring herself that her apple trees had survived her absence and remained capable of producing the miraculous fruit that sustained the entire divine community. The immediate effects of Idunn's return became apparent within hours, as her presence alone began to restore the natural magical rhythms that governed the cultivation and ripening of the golden apples. The trees that had shown signs of decline during her absence straightened their drooping branches and began displaying the subtle luminescence that indicated their fruit was approaching optimal potency. The crystalline barriers that protected the grove resonated with renewed energy as Idunn's divine essence re-established its connection to the cosmic forces that flowed through Yggdrasil's root system and sustained the fundamental processes of renewal throughout the 9 worlds. The first renewal ceremony following Idunn's rescue took place with unprecedented solemnity and gratitude, as each god approached the restored goddess with full awareness of how close they had come to losing their source of eternal vitality forever. The ritual consumption of the golden apples proceeded according to ancient protocols, but the familiar process carried new meaning for participants who had experienced the terrifying reality of divine aging and the gradual loss of capabilities that define their essential nature. Thor's legendary strength returned with the first bite of his apple, while Odin's mental acuity sharpened to levels that exceeded even his normal formidable capabilities. The physical transformation that occurred as the gods consumed Idunn's fruit after their period of enforced abstinence was more dramatic than any renewal ceremony in their collective memory. Years of accumulated aging reversed themselves within moments as divine tissues restructured according to their optimal patterns and supernatural capabilities returned to full potency. Heimdall's vision regained its legendary clarity, allowing him to perceive events across vast distances with the precision that his duties as guardian of the Bifrost required. Freya's mastery over cedar magic returned to its full power, while Baldur's radiant presence once again illuminated the halls of Asgard with the inner light that made him beloved throughout the 9 worlds. The psychological impact of renewal extended beyond simple relief at the restoration of their physical capabilities to encompass a profound appreciation for the gift that Idunn provided and the vulnerability that her absence had revealed. The gods' experience of gradual weakening had demonstrated their absolute dependence upon her careful stewardship of the golden apples, transforming what had previously been taken for granted into a conscious recognition of the miraculous nature of their continued existence. This new awareness would influence their relationships with Idunn and their approach to protecting the source of their immortality for countless ages to come. The long-term consequences of Thiazi's kidnapping scheme and its violent resolution reverberated throughout the 9 worlds as news of the giant's death spread among the various supernatural communities that maintained the delicate balance between order and chaos. The elimination of one of Jotunheim's most powerful inhabitants created a vacuum in giant society that would eventually be filled by other ambitious beings seeking to claim his territory and influence. However, The manner of his death served as a stark warning about the consequences of directly threatening Asgard's essential interests, demonstrating that the gods possessed both the determination and the capability to eliminate threats through coordinated, magical warfare that could overcome even the most formidable individual opponents. The increased vigilance that characterized Asgard's defensive posture following these events reflected hard-learned lessons about the vulnerabilities that existed within their previously assumed security. The ease with which Thiazi had exploited existing trust relationships and internal knowledge to achieve his goals forced the gods to reconsider their assumptions about the sources from which threats might emerge. New protocols were established for monitoring the movements and activities of all divine community members, while additional protective measures were implemented around Idunn's grove to prevent any future attempts at unauthorized access or interference with the cultivation of the golden apples. Heimdall's responsibilities as guardian of the Bifrost expanded to include systematic surveillance of giant territories for signs of organized threats or unusual activities that might indicate preparations for revenge attacks or similar schemes. His supernatural perception was supplemented by networks of magical sensors positioned throughout the boundary regions between different realms, creating an early warning system that would detect hostile movements long before they could approach Asgard's borders. These defensive improvements represented a fundamental shift from reactive security measures to proactive threat assessment and prevention that would characterize divine policy for the remainder of their existence. The magical research initiated in response to the crisis focused on developing alternative sources of renewal that could serve as backup systems in case Idunn's apples ever became unavailable again. Teams of gods with expertise in various mystical disciplines collaborated on projects designed to understand the fundamental principles that governed the golden apple's regenerative properties and determine whether similar effects could be achieved through different magical techniques. These investigations revealed the unique nature of Idunn's gift and the specific cosmic connections that made her fruit irreplaceable, though they also produced valuable knowledge about divine physiology and the magical processes that sustained immortal existence. The relationship between Idunn and her fellow gods underwent subtle but significant changes as a result of her ordeal and rescue. The goddess found herself receiving unprecedented attention and protection from divine authorities who had previously taken her security for granted, while her own perspective on her role within the community evolved to encompass a deeper understanding of her strategic importance and the responsibilities that came with being the sole source of divine renewal. Her interactions with Loki remained complex and somewhat strained, as gratitude for his successful rescue mission competed with awareness of his role in creating the crisis that had made rescue necessary. Loki's status within Asgard's society reflected the complicated nature of his actions during the kidnapping crisis, as his ultimate success in recovering Idunn could not entirely erase the betrayal that had made the rescue necessary in the first place. The trickster god found himself subject to increased scrutiny and reduced trust from his fellow gods, though his demonstrated willingness to risk his life for the divine community's welfare had prevented complete ostracism or severe punishment. His relationship with the other gods would remain forever marked by the knowledge that he was capable of betrayal under sufficient pressure, while also being capable of heroic action when the consequences of his mistakes became clear. The broader implications of these events for Norse cosmological thought encompassed fundamental questions about the nature of divine existence and the relationship between immortality and vulnerability that would influence theological understanding for generations. The temporary aging of the gods had demonstrated that their immortality was conditional rather than absolute, dependent upon continued access to external sources of renewal rather than inherent in their divine nature. This revelation challenged assumptions about the fundamental differences between gods and mortals, suggesting that divine status was maintained through specific magical processes rather than representing a categorically different form of existence. Idunn's role as the essential preserver of divine immortality became more explicitly recognised and celebrated following her rescue, with new rituals and ceremonies developed to honour her contributions to the divine community's continued existence. The goddess's position within Asgard's hierarchy was formally elevated to reflect her strategic importance, while additional resources were allocated to support her work and ensure the optimal conditions for apple cultivation. These changes represented both practical security improvements and symbolic recognition of the fundamental role that renewal played in maintaining the cosmic order that the gods existed to protect. The cyclical nature of renewal that Idunn's apples represented took on enhanced symbolic significance as the gods contemplated their experience of temporary aging and the restoration that had followed their consumption of the golden fruit. This cycle of decline and regeneration reflected broader patterns within Norse cosmological thought about the relationship between destruction and creation, death and rebirth, that characterize the fundamental processes governing existence throughout the nine worlds. The gods' personal experience of this cycle provided them with deeper understanding of the forces they worked to maintain and protect against the chaotic influences that sought to disrupt the ordered patterns of cosmic existence. The magical properties of the golden apples themselves became subjects of intensive study as the gods sought to understand the mechanisms by which Idunn's fruit accomplished its miraculous effects. Research revealed that each apple contained concentrated essence of temporal reversal that operated at the cellular level to repair accumulated damage and restore optimal function to divine physiology. The fruit's magic worked by creating localized fields where entropy temporarily reversed its normal direction, allowing living tissues to return to their peak condition rather than continuing the gradual decline that characterized normal aging processes. The cosmic connections that sustained the apple tree's ability to produce their miraculous fruit extended through Yggdrasil's root system to draw energy from fundamental sources that predated the current cosmic order. These connections explained why the trees could only flourish under Idunn's direct care, and why attempts to cultivate similar fruit elsewhere had invariably failed. The goddess's divine nature allowed her to serve as a conduit for cosmic forces that were too powerful and chaotic for direct manipulation by other beings, channeling them through her consciousness and will into the stable patterns that characterize the golden apple's regenerative magic. The strategic importance of controlling access to divine renewal had been dramatically demonstrated by Thiazi's scheme, revealing how leverage over essential resources could potentially reshape the balance of power throughout the nine worlds. This recognition prompted discussions about the distribution and security of other critical resources that sustain the cosmic order, leading to improved protection for various magical artifacts and strategic locations that enemies might target in future conflicts. The gods developed contingency plans for maintaining essential functions even if key personnel or resources became temporarily unavailable, though none of these alternatives could fully replace Idunn's unique capabilities. The theological implications of the gods' temporary mortality extended beyond immediate practical concerns to encompass fundamental questions about the nature of divine responsibility and the relationship between power and vulnerability that characterized their role as cosmic guardians. The experience of aging had reminded the gods that their authority to maintain order throughout the nine worlds derived not from inherent superiority, but from their access to specific magical resources and their willingness to use those resources for the benefit of all existence. This understanding reinforced their commitment to protecting the sources of their power, while also acknowledging the conditional nature of their divine status. The restoration of Idunn and the renewal of divine vitality marked not merely the resolution of a temporary crisis, but the reaffirmation of the gods' essential role as eternal guardians of cosmic order. The golden apples that the goddess tended with such care represented more than simple sources of youth and strength. They embodied the principle of hope itself, the promise that decline and decay could be reversed through proper knowledge and careful stewardship. In a cosmos where the forces of entropy and chaos constantly pressed against the boundaries of organised existence, Idunn's gift provided the renewable foundation upon which all other achievements could be built and maintained. The legacy of these events would endure throughout the remaining ages of divine rule, serving as both cautionary tale about the vulnerabilities that existed within seemingly secure systems, an inspiring example of the courage and determination that could overcome even the most desperate circumstances. The successful rescue of Idunn demonstrated that cooperation and sacrifice could triumph over individual ambition and external threats, while the restoration of a divine renewal ensured that the gods would continue their eternal vigil against the forces that sought to return the cosmos to primordial chaos. In the golden halls of Asgard, where the goddess once again tended her miraculous trees, the cycle of renewal continued its eternal rhythm, sustaining the divine community that stood as the final bulwark against the approaching darkness of Ragnarok.